The bike hit every pothole on Maple Row like it had a personal vendetta against silence. That squeal, high, grinding, unmistakable, echoed off the glass storefronts and marble stoops of the richest street in town before Leo even came into view. By the time he did, heads were already turning. He kept his eyes forward. Always did. The frame was more rust than paint at this point, the kind of orange-brown that told you this thing had seen more winters than most of the SUVs parked along the curb. One pedal wobbled. The handlebar grips were duct-taped, cracked underneath from years of sun and use. It looked like something you'd find abandoned behind a scrapyard. Not something a 14-year-old rode proudly down the nicest block in the city. "Here comes Rusty," someone muttered from a cafe patio, not even bothering to lower his voice. A woman walking her dog laughed under her breath. A group of kids on brand-new bikes, the kind with disc brakes and carbon frames, swerved wide around him like he was contagious. Leo didn't flinch, didn't slow down, didn't speed up either. He'd heard it all before. The nicknames, the stares, the way certain neighbors would cross the street just so they wouldn't have to share the sidewalk with him and his junkyard special. As one man had called it the week before, loud enough for the whole block to hear. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly guessed, was that the bike creaking beneath him wasn't garbage. It wasn't a hand-me-down some charity dropped off. It was the last piece of something enormous, something buried under 30 years of silence. And in a matter of days, this same street full of people who wouldn't look him in the eye would be standing frozen, watching that junkyard special lead 2,000 machines through the heart of their town. But that morning, all they saw was a rusty bike and a kid who didn't belong. Leo didn't talk much. Never had. Teachers called it shyness. Kids at school called it weird. But the truth was simpler than either of those. He just didn't see the point in wasting words on people who'd already decided who he was. Every night, no matter how tired he was, he'd wheel the bike into the garage of the group home, flip it upside down on its seat, and go to work. A rag, a little oil, careful fingers running along the chain, the spokes, the frame, like he was tending to something alive, something that mattered more than anything else he owned, which honestly wasn't much. The other kids thought it was strange. One of them had asked him once, half joking, why he babied a piece of scrap metal like it was a Ferrari. Leo hadn't answered. He just kept wiping down the frame, slow and steady, until the kid got bored and walked away. What nobody at the group home knew was the photograph folded into the inside pocket of his jacket, soft at the creases from being opened so many times. In it, a much younger version of the same bike stood gleaming under a hard afternoon sun, and beside it, one hand resting on the seat, stood a man Leo barely remembered. His grandfather. Behind them, blurred just enough to hide details, stood a wall of other bikes. Dozens of them. Maybe more. Leo used to ask about that photo. Who were the men standing behind his grandfather? Where was it taken? Why did his grandfather look so at ease, like he owned that road and everyone on it respected the ground he stood on? Nobody ever gave him a straight answer. Just a pat on the shoulder and a change of subject. So Leo stopped asking. He just kept the photo close, and the bike closer, treating both like they held answers he hadn't earned yet. And every night, in that quiet garage, he polished the one thing that connected him to a past nobody wanted to explain, never once imagining how loud that silence was about to break. Weekday mornings on Maple Row looked like a catalog shoot. Kids rolling out of driveways on bikes that cost more than some cars, helmets color-matched to their backpacks, parents trailing behind in cars that idled quiet as a whisper. Leo's route to school cut right through the middle of it, and every single day, the contrast played out like clockwork. A pack of boys from the private academy would spot him first. Matching jackets, matching sneakers, bikes gleaming like they'd never touched a speck of dirt. They'd slow down just enough to ride circles around him, laughing, making sure he heard every word. Yo! Does that thing even have brakes? Bro found that in a dumpster. Rusty's here. Everyone looked busy. Leo kept pedaling. Eyes on the road. The wobble in his front wheel never got worse, never got better. It was just part of the rhythm now. Something his body had learned to work around the same way he'd learned to work around the comments. Adults weren't much better, just quieter about it. A woman power walking with earbuds in would glance at the bike, then at Leo, then look away fast, like eye contact might make the poverty rub off on her. A man washing his car once told him, not unkindly but not kindly either, that the city had programs for bikes like that. Meaning replace it, meaning why are you still riding that thing? Nobody asked why he kept it. Nobody wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a reason a kid with nothing held onto one broken down bike like it was the last solid thing in his world. They just saw rust. They just saw poor. They just saw a kid who didn't belong on their street, in their school, in their world. What they didn't see, what not one of them could have predicted, was that the junkyard special they mocked every single morning was about to answer for itself in a way none of them would ever forget. It happened on a Thursday, right around the time the afternoon heat starts pressing down hard on the blacktop. Leo was taking the long way home, the route that cut along the edge of the highway before looping back through town, when he spotted them. For bikers, big machines, the kind that usually roared through town and were gone before anyone got a good look. Except these weren't roaring anywhere. They were pulled off onto the shoulder, hazards blinking. One guy crouched by an engine that had clearly given up for the day. Cars zipped past without slowing. A couple of drivers even sped up, like 4 grown men in leather vests on the side of the road were something to avoid rather than help. Leo watched 2, 3, 4 cars blow right by. Nobody stopped. Nobody even tapped the brakes. He didn't think about it much. He just turned the handlebars and rode toward them. Up close, they looked rougher than they had from a distance. Patched vests, sun-worn faces, the kind of tired that comes from miles, not just heat. One of them straightened up fast when he saw Leo coming, hand moving instinctively toward his belt before he clocked what he was actually looking at. A kid, on a bike barely holding itself together. "You good?" Leo asked, stopping a few feet off. The bikers exchanged a look. Not suspicion exactly. More like they weren't used to anyone stopping at all, let alone someone who looked like he had less than they did. "Bike's dead," the one crouched by the engine said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Phone's got no signal out here. Was starting to think we'd be stuck till dark." Leo didn't have a phone worth mentioning and even less cash in his pocket. But he had directions, knew the stretch of road better than anyone, knew exactly where the nearest gas station with a mechanic sat, knew the shortcut that would save them 20 minutes of walking. So he told them, slow, clear, no attitude, no hesitation. Same way he'd talk anyone through anything. It was such a small thing. Directions. A little water from the bottle in his backpack. Nothing that should have mattered. But one of the bikers wasn't looking at Leo's face anymore. He was staring at the handlebars, at the small worn emblem stamped into the metal, one Leo had never thought twice about because it had simply always been there. The biker's expression shifted. Fast. Like he'd just seen something he thought didn't exist anymore. "Where'd you get this bike?" the biker asked, voice suddenly a lot more careful than it had been 30 seconds ago. Leo shrugged, one hand still resting on the handlebars. "It was my grandfather's. Guess it just got passed down." The other 3 bikers had gone quiet now too, drifting closer, eyes locked on that small, worn emblem stamped into the metal like it was something sacred. One of them crouched down, running a thumb along the edge of it, careful, like he was afraid it might disappear if he pressed too hard. "You know what this is?" the first biker asked, not mocking, not curious in the way strangers usually were. There was something else in his voice, something closer to disbelief. Leo shook his head. Nobody had ever told him. He'd asked plenty of times and always gotten the same brush off, the same subject change, the same closed door. The biker looked at him for a long moment, like he was trying to decide something. Then he straightened up, glanced at his buddies and just said, "Doesn't matter right now. Thanks for the help, kid." That was it. No explanation. No name. Just 4 grown men suddenly moving with a kind of urgency that hadn't been there a minute ago. Pulling out radios, murmuring low into them, throwing glances back at Leo and his bike like they were checking to make sure it was still real. Leo didn't push it. He wasn't the type to demand answers from people who clearly weren't ready to give them. His grandfather used to say something about that, back when Leo was young enough to still be asking questions out loud. Something about how the road always reveals itself, eventually, to the person who already knows where he's going. Leo hadn't understood it back then. He still didn't, not really. but it felt like the kind of thing that was about to matter. He said his goodbyes, climbed back on the bike, and pedaled off toward home, that familiar squeal picking up with every rotation of the wheel. Behind him, one of the bikers was still on the radio, voice low, urgent, repeating 3 words that would have meant nothing to Leo and everything to whoever was listening on the other end. "We found him." Leo didn't think much more about it that night. He got home, wheeled the bike into the garage like always, gave it the usual once-over with the rag even though nothing about the ride had gotten it particularly dirty. His mind was somewhere else, replaying the way those 4 grown men had gone from ignoring him like everyone else to staring at his handlebars like they'd seen a ghost. He pulled out the photograph before bed, the one with his grandfather standing next to this same bike, that blurry wall of other riders behind him. He'd looked at that photo 1,000 times. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like it was looking back. 2 towns over, in a garage that smelled like motor oil and old leather. 4 men stood around a phone propped against a toolbox, a 5th voice crackling through the speaker. "You're sure it's him?" the voice said. Not a question. More like someone needing to hear it twice. Same emblem, same frame. Kid's got no clue what he's sitting on. A long pause on the other end. Long enough that one of the bikers shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the silence. 30 years. The voice finally said, quiet now, almost reverent. "We've been looking for that bike for 30 years. Nobody in that garage said anything for a moment. Then the voice on the phone spoke again. Sharper this time, all business. "Get the word out. Everyone. Every chapter, every state. Tell them we found the king's bike." The line went dead. The 4 bikers looked at each other, and one of them, the one who'd knelt down to touch that emblem on the highway, just shook his head slowly. "That kid," he said, "has no idea what's about to hit his town." The next morning started like any other, except it didn't finish that way. Leo woke to a silence that felt off before he could even name why. No delivery trucks rumbling down Maple Row. No dogs barking at the mail carrier. No early joggers with their clipped little greetings to each other. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your ears instead of resting in them. He figured it was nothing. Shrugged it off, got dressed, wheeled his bike out of the garage same as always. The squeal of the wheel felt louder than usual in a street this still. Around town, the same unease was creeping into everyone else's morning. The woman who always walked her dog past the cafe stood on her porch a beat too long, frowning. And in the middle of all that scrambling, All that locking and hiding and whispering, one figure didn't move toward a door at all. Leo stepped out into the middle of the road. Alone. His rusty, squealing bike rolled beside him, wobbling front wheel and all, looking smaller and more fragile than ever against the growing wall of dust on the horizon. Someone from a window shouted at him to get inside, to run, to hide like everyone else. Leo didn't even turn his head. He walked to the center of the highway, planted his feet, and stood there. A kid, a broken-down bike, and 2,000 machines thundering straight toward him like the whole world was about to collide with a single rusty frame that nobody in that town had ever bothered to understand. The wall of dust broke apart into shapes. Then the shapes broke apart into bikes, hundreds of them. Then more, rows stretching back so far the end of the line disappeared into the haze behind them. Chrome catching sunlight, leather jackets snapping in the wind, engines so loud they swallowed every other sound in town, rattling windows a full block away. Behind the curtains and locked doors of Maple Row, faces pressed to glass, certain, absolutely certain, that whatever was about to happen next was the end of something. Some people were already dialing for help, hands shaking, eyes wide, watching 2,000 machines roll toward their quiet little street like a slow-motion catastrophe nobody could stop. And right in the middle of the road, small and unmoving, stood Leo, one hand on his rusty handlebars, chin up, not a flicker of fear on his face, even as the noise grew loud enough to drown out his own heartbeat. The front line of riders spotted him first. A hand went up, a signal, and it rippled backward through the pack like a wave, bike after bike after bike easing off the throttle, slowing, until what had sounded like an unstoppable stampede started grinding down into something else entirely. Silence. 2,000 engines cut off almost in unison. The sudden quiet more deafening than the roar had been. Dust settled slow around them, drifting gold in the morning light. Every single rider sat frozen on their bike, eyes locked on the same spot. A rusty, wobbling, duct-taped bicycle, and the kid standing beside it like he had absolutely no idea he was standing at the center of something enormous. Nobody in that town moved. Nobody breathed. Because right then, none of them understood what they were looking at. That was about to change. The crowd of riders parted like water splitting around a stone, clearing a path down the center as one bike rolled forward from somewhere deep in the pack. The man riding it wasn't the biggest, wasn't the loudest, but the second his wheels started moving, every single rider on that highway straightened up like they were standing at attention. He rolled to a stop a few feet from Leo, killed his engine, and swung off the bike slow and deliberate, like every motion mattered. Up close, his face was weathered, lined with decades of sun and road, and his eyes, when they landed on Leo's bike, went glassy in a way that didn't match the leather and the patches and the hard-worn look of him. Then he did something nobody on Maple Row, watching wide-eyed through their windows, ever expected. He dropped to one knee, right there on the asphalt, in front of a 14-year-old kid and his broken-down bicycle. "The king's bike," he said, voice cracking on the words, "has finally been found." Leo just stood there, frozen, hands still resting on those cracked, duct-taped grips. I don't understand." The man looked up at him, and for the first time, Leo saw something in a stranger's eyes that he'd never once gotten from anyone on his own street. Respect. Real, unshakable respect. "Your grandfather," the man said, rising slowly to his feet, "wasn't just some old man with a bike, son. He was the Grand Chief. Built this whole brotherhood from nothing. Every rider behind me, every chapter in this country, all of it traces back to him." He reached out, laying a careful hand on the worn seat like it might crumble under the weight of his palm. This bike wasn't just his ride. It was his throne, and when he passed, it disappeared. We've been looking for 30 years. Behind him, 2,000 riders sat in absolute silence, watching a kid they'd never met stand next to a piece of history they thought was lost forever. On the porches and behind the curtains of Maple Row, the people who'd spent years calling him Rusty stood frozen, watching their whole understanding of that kid crumble in real time. Nobody on Maple Row said a word. Not the man who'd once told Leo the city had programs for kids like him. Not the woman who used to cross the street rather than share a sidewalk with a rusty bike and the boy who rode it. Not the group of private school kids who'd circled him on their brand new bikes just days earlier, laughing, calling him things they'd never dare say now. They just stood there, frozen behind glass and porch railings, watching 2,000 riders sit in total silence around a 14-year-old kid they'd spent years mocking. The Grand Chief's second-in-command turned to face the crowd of riders, raising his voice loud enough to carry down the whole street. "This is the grandson of the man who built everything we are," he called out. "Every road we ride, every chapter we call home. It all started with him. And it's been sitting 50 feet from some of you, and none of you saw it." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not directed at Leo, but at the town. At every person who'd looked at that bike and seen garbage instead of legacy. At every person who'd looked at that kid and seen less than nothing. Leo stood in the middle of it all, still holding the handlebars, still not entirely sure what to do with 2,000 strangers treating him like royalty he never knew he was. But something in his chest had shifted. A quiet, steady kind of pride replacing years of being looked past, looked down on, looked through. His grandfather's words came back to him then, clearer than they'd ever been. The road always shows itself to the one who already knows where he's going. Leo hadn't known where he was going. Not really. But somehow, without ever meaning to, he'd been riding straight toward this moment his entire life. And every single person on that street, the ones who'd laughed, the ones who'd sneered, the ones who'd simply looked away, finally understood exactly what they'd been mocking all along. The Grand Chief mounted his bike but didn't start the engine. Instead, he gestured toward the open road ahead, toward the heart of Maple Row, toward the very street that had spent years looking down on the kids standing beside him. "Lead the way," he said. "It's your road now." Leo didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He just swung his leg over that same rusty frame, wrapped his hands around those same duct-taped grips, and started pedaling, that familiar squeal echoing out into a silence so complete you could hear it bounce off the storefronts. Behind him, 2,000 engines roared back to life in perfect unison. A sound like rolling thunder, finally given permission to move again. And they fell in line. Not in front of him, not beside him, but behind him, a river of chrome and leather trailing a boy on a bike that had been worth more than any of them realized their entire lives. They rode straight through the middle of Maple Row, past the cafe where people used to laugh, past the driveway where kids on brand new bikes used to circle him just to make him feel small, past every porch, every window, every person who'd ever called him rusty like it was something to be ashamed of. Nobody laughed now. Nobody looked away. They just stood frozen on their perfect lawns and their expensive porches, watching an orphan they'd dismissed for years lead 2,000 riders down their street like he'd been born to it. Because in every way that mattered, he had been. Leo didn't look back at any of them. He didn't need their apologies, didn't need their stares to change into something else. He already had what he'd been missing his whole life, riding right behind him in a wall of thunder and chrome. The bike squealed on, same as always. Except now, for the first time, everyone in that town finally understood exactly what that sound had always meant.